So welcome everybody. I'm Catherine Sheehy. I'm the Global Lead of Sustainability Partnerships at UL, and I am the co-chair of our Pride UL Business Resource Group. The pride in our name stands for people recognizing identities and differences for equality. And we are super glad to be a copper level sponsor of this week's event and to be involved in tonight's panel. Now, before I introduce the panel, a couple of housekeeping notes. If you haven't already, I did mention this, please take a moment to take our poll. It's available on the platform landing page. And the poll question is, how would you rate how safe you feel having conversations about LGBTQ plus identities, benefits, and equality in your workplace? Also, feel free to post questions on the landing page for this session. I'll be monitoring that. If you happen to put it in the chat, I'll try to pick it up there as well. And so with that, I'm really glad to be able to introduce you to my colleague, Chris Hasbrook, and our two panelists, Claudia Bryn-Woody and Mark Nichols. Now, Chris is VP and GM of UL's Built Environment Customer Operating Unit. And he's been with UL for 18 years, which means that he has this range of experiences across our safety, security, and sustainability service offerings. He's also a civic leader, for example, serving as co-founder and treasurer of the Chicago Fire Department Foundation. He's one of 3 executive co-sponsors of Pride UL, and he'll be moderating our panel. Thanks, Chris.
Thank you.
Claudia is Managing Director, Global Intellectual Property and Licensing at IBM, where she's been for 25 years. And before that, she served on the Atlanta Committee for the Olympic Games, was Associate Dean of the McCombs School of Business, was the Assistant Athletics Director at the University of Texas in Austin and University of Tennessee. She's also a recognized leader in the LGBTQ plus community. For example, she received the 2011 Out and Equal Trailblazer Award, and she's joining us from the UK, which means that it's very late night. So thank you, Claudia, and welcome.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And finally, Mark Nichols, Executive Vice President, General Counsel and Company Secretary for Saab businesses in the US and Canada. He's got more than 20 years experience in the aerospace and defense industries. He served in private practice, other corporate counsel roles. He once was Inspector General of the US Government Printing Office. Mark is also active in his communities, including as a board member of Crystal House International. And Mark, too, is a recognized leader of the LGBTQ plus community, including among his work having served on the HRC Business Council. And so welcome, Mark.
Thank you.
Now I'm going to hand over the mic to Chris. Before I do, I just want to give a quick update on our poll. So the answers to our poll are about 50-50, and I'm glad to say the majority of respondents say that they feel very safe, and others, about 47%, say they feel moderately safe discussing LGBTQ plus identities, benefits, and equality in the workplace. About 4% say not safe, and about 1% say other. So with that said, I'm going to put myself on mute. I'm going to turn it over to Chris, and you'll hear back from me when we leave about 15 minutes or so for questions at the end. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Catherine. Mark, Claudia, welcome. Just a few notes more about UL and our work here. I'm one of the 3 executive co-sponsors, as Catherine mentioned, of our Pride UL BRG. We have almost 300 active members in our Pride UL, launched in 2018. We signed on to the Equality Act this year. A major objective for us is to achieve at least 90% of the next HRC Corporate Equality Index, which we're eagerly awaiting now, and that would reflect the results of a cross-functional team working on this. UL has broad diversity objectives, and our diversity report is available for download from our booth, so please visit that virtually. So overview of breakthrough conversations. You know, when you think about breakthrough conversations at work, you have these kind of conversations, getting a tough conversations. Perhaps it's about a project or an initiative that maybe needs to have a report completed, or something is going amiss, you need to get back on track. Or there are also very positive conversations where you can have a breakthrough conversation about somebody's career, learning more about them and their opportunities and capabilities. These are all we call kind of these breakthrough conversations about work. But breakthrough conversations also relate to how we foster diversity, equity, and inclusion in our own organizations that really are part of unleashing the full creative power of our people. So when we're at UL and we talk about this in UL in relation to DE&I, we talk about safety. UL is about 128 years old. It's a company known for testing products and helping deliver testing results and helping create safe living and working environments. So we talk more about just physical safety at UL, but more recently we've talked about mental health and mental safety as well, especially screen fatigue with COVID, and mental health has become really important and top of mind for our CEO and for the executives here talking about mental health and safety. So all these conversations really require trust, authenticity, being fully present, and being open to honest feedback. And I've had a number of these, I'm sure, as Mark and Claudia have as well. So today we're going to talk about critical success factors for breakthrough conversations about LGBTQ plus diversity in the workplace, our experiences with them, and really how we'd like to set the foundation for business success. I have a particular interest in one of the questions we'll get to later, but I'd like to start that conversation now. So Mark or Claudia, anything else you'd like to say before we get into the questions and the meat of our conversation? Okay, great. So first, I mentioned safety earlier. We had a conversation before today's call about that word safety. And we use it about physical safety, building safety. We even use psychological safety in our panel discussion and our preparation and in some of the materials we use inside of UL. So Claudia, I'd like to start with you. If you could please share a little more of your work to advance LGBTQ equality and tell us what does the idea of mental or personal safety mean to you, and we'll come to Mark as well, but that safety within organizations.
Sure, thank you. I'm really privileged to stand on the IBM brand, where we've been a leader in diversity for many, many years, with our first non-discrimination policy back in 1953. So it's been a privilege to be able to be an advocate and a spokesperson for IBM in my night job, anyway, on LGBT plus diversity particularly. I am the emeritus co-chair of our IBM executive task force in the LGBT diversity space, and have had the privilege of working on boards such as Out and Equal Board or Workplace Pride. And so it really has been an opportunity to look at safety from a global lens. And it depends on where you are in the world, including places in the United States where physical safety for LGBT plus colleagues is still very important, particularly outside of the workplace environment. There's still places where our employees have that physical safety issue. But the psychological safety within the walls, within work, is even more important in some aspects, because that's really about the ease that a person has in being authentic. So if that psychological safety is not there, the opportunity to be authentic or the willingness to be authentic is not there. And we still have, large numbers of people in the closet at work, wherever we are. 35% is a number that a lot of people have used in terms of the understanding of people feeling like they have to lie about their personal lives at work. But more disturbing to me are the number of people who are out at university and then come into the workplace and feel like they have to go back into the closet, or even some research that just showed 54% of the people who are out at work are not out to their clients or their customers. Mm-hmm. So that psychological safety is that indicator of why they aren't, when people are not willing to take a risk to lose their job, lose a promotion, or perhaps just not take the risk to be creative and innovative because they're afraid to put themselves authentically out there. So really important topic.
Yeah, thank you for those comments. Mark, would you add to that, please?
Yeah, thank you. First of all, thanks for having me. I think I agree with everything Claudia just said. I think the other tack or the other way to think about this as well is, we're in a lot of political upheaval. There's a lot of criticism about, so-called woke culture. And to me, it always seems to suggest that people don't really understand what woke culture is about. It is about psychological safety, to be able to call you what you wish to be called by, and respect that is what woke culture and woke language is supposed to be about. So when we're talking about LGBTQ language in the workplace, we're trying to respect people for who they are. And so that, as Claudia mentioned, you can bring your full self to the office and that be respected. That's part of the reason why we use, gender identification or gender pronouns. What pronouns do you want to be called by? That's not off-putting. That's not putting people out to ask you to be respectful to how they would like to be addressed. That's all part of a culture that has to imbue a corporation or a workplace in general that gives some indicia to employees about whether they will be respected. And if the company or the workplace is not willing to do that, then it calls into all sorts of questions about all sorts of other types of safety for employees. Whether it's psychological, whether it's professional. Are you going to be looking out for my career? Can I really truly advance here because you respect me and you respect my work? Can I make sure that my family is going to be secure? What kinds of health insurance policies are you going to have in place? So I can make sure that I do have the full effect of psychological safety. And that's really what we're talking about. So I always kind of look, a little bit askance when I hear people say, are we just talking about woke culture? Well, yeah, we are, but let's make sure we understand exactly what we are talking about here when we use that kind of language, because that language can also be incredibly hurtful if we don't pay heed to it.
Yeah. Thank you. You might recall when we had our preparation meeting, and I want to go back to what Claudia mentioned about leaving university and going to work. One of the things we talked about, the three of us, and Catherine, was how do we, as an interviewer or a hiring manager, encourage and create an environment where people can bring their full selves to work. They can identify in any way they'd like, and make sure that the interviewer is aware of that if they feel comfortable to do so. I think that that's a really important thing. We talk about recruiting, and everybody has numbers to hit and recruit, but how does a manager know if it's not obvious to the manager, visually obvious or some other way? Maybe the person has written a letter in advance or an email in advance. What are some ideas that you want to recall that conversation we had? Would you like to talk about that? How would a hiring manager broach a subject or begin to talk about diversity? Maybe that's just it. Maybe the hiring manager could say, we have a fantastic diversity program here. And that's a good lead for a hiring manager to do. But I am fascinated by this, because to be out publicly at a university and then be less willing to share that at work, I think there's something, I don't want to say wrong, there's something that needs to be addressed there.
Yeah.
Claudia, would you like to go first on that?
Sure. I'll jump in because Mark is right. Language matters. Language matters. So as a hiring manager, if you're using inclusive language in whatever you're talking about, if you're talking about the benefits program for, same-sex spouses, right? Or those types of things. If you're opening up questions about, do you have any questions about our diversity programs? Inviting that kind of interaction, because in our battle for talent, we want the best and brightest. And all of those really best and brightest folks should be interviewing us as companies to understand if they really can perform at their best in our company. So they should be interviewing us as much as we are them. And as part of that, how we use language, how we open discussion topics like diversity are really very important.
Yeah, I would just tack on to that. As a executive, I tell my team that we have conversations before we interview anybody. We have a checklist of what we're looking for. We're looking for technical skills. We're looking for emotional ability to deal with a stressful work environment. We're looking for people who think well on their feet. You have a whole bunch of things on that checklist. Is diversity and making sure that message gets across on that checklist? And if so, how do you engage in that conversation to make that potential employee know that this is a driver within the company, and that the culture within the company also is that we are looking for and striving for greater diversity. So all sorts of indicia, whatever that is for your workplace. I think somebody said, are there LGBTQ executives, within the top ranks of the company? Sure, that's one indicia. There may not be, but that's not the only indicia you're looking for. Is there a non-discrimination policy? Are managers measured by what types of diversity that they're going to be recruiting for? And is their bonus potentially tied to results in that? Are they being measured at all? I always tell people, as a corporation or a workplace environment, if it's really important to us, we measure everything, right? So if they're not measuring it, that honestly tells you where their heart really is. Because if it was really important to them, they'd be measuring it, because that's what corporations do. So, look for different strands that you can pull. We're human beings. We go into a situation, and we're trying to figure out whether we're in a dangerous place or whether we're in a safe place. Trust your instincts. Pull information, ask questions to say, what exactly do you do? How is it measured? What exactly would I do in this situation? Who was the last LGBT folks that you promoted, and into what positions? There's a whole host of questions that you can be asking that will give you a better comfort, or give you a better comfort about your decision, one way or the other.
Yeah, thank you.
Let me jump in. Sorry.
Please.
And it's important for us as employees to speak up and ask those questions, right? It's important for us to not only ask that our companies measure things and include LGBT plus on slates of candidates, but then we've got to be willing to raise our hand and self-ID, right? We have to be willing to be visible so our companies can find us and our managers can know us. So it's a two-way street. That we have to have that courage, and having courage means there has to be a bit of, back to the psychological safety, there has to be enough of that for us to also help our companies advance.
That's another strand. If you don't feel comfortable self-identifying, then that's probably not the place where you should be.
True. Yeah, true. I mean, I'm thinking now as we think about hiring, from recruiting all the way through interviewing to job acceptance. I'm curious if anybody wants to post an answer to my question. We'll get to it toward the end. But my question is, has any company, are there any HR representatives on our call today who have gone through the entire process and looked at each step? An example is I might get an interview guide for a type of hire we'd like to have, like an engineer, like out of college. But they're pretty much like some case studies. Could you tell me about how you dealt with the situation, or what your GPA was, or even an experienced hire? It might be more like, is there a time in your career when you've had to do X, Y, and Z? It'd be great to have headings up front to say, remember, as you're doing this interview, when you're talking about UL or talking about a company, whatever your company would be, to include these facts about that, right? It's almost like a nudge to have that happen. So I'm curious if IBM's done that, or if Saab has done that, or anybody else who would comment. Are you aware of anybody who's gone step by step and looked at the entire recruiting process?
Yes, so Saab is in the process of doing that now, because it wasn't something that we had done. And I think, like a lot of companies post George Floyd, we all sort of took a much more deeper internal look in terms of how we were going about diversity, equity, and inclusion, and whether there was more that we could be doing. And the answer was obviously, I think across the board, almost everywhere, is that, yeah, we could be doing a lot more and a lot better.
Yeah.
One of the things I was told my company when I used to work for Rolls-Royce prior to my current position is it's okay to start from a bad position, meaning you don't always have to have every answer, but you've got to have a willingness to grow. And I think that's really the message. When we first did, when I was at Rolls-Royce, when we first did the Corporate Equality Index, fortunately we had a president and CEO who was 100% on board. But the first numbers we got back were, I think, we're in the 50s. They were just terrible, but she went ahead and published them anyway, because she said, this is a starting point. And I'm adopting this as our starting point. And 3 years from now, I want to be at 100. So, and I want that message to go forward. And 3 years later, that's exactly where Rolls-Royce was. Leadership, it starts by looking and starting with a plan, whether it's the recruitment process, on the onboarding process. Once you're on board, what kind of resources and things do you have for your employees, and how do you develop them to make sure that you've got from soup to nuts, really, in terms of employee life cycle at a corporation, that they can thrive and they feel comfortable, from a psychological standpoint. So yeah, we're looking at recruiting, but we're also looking at other parts of that.
Sure. Yeah, and at IBM, we've looked at the talent acquisition process, for many years, and have continued to improve it. We consult on it with other companies, and we are glad, particularly in the diversity space, right, to share best practices, right? We think that together as corporations, we are stronger, particularly in the LGBT plus space. Joining together gives us corporate courage sometimes, that particularly depending on where in the world we're operating, that's helpful, right? But we've been doing the talent acquisition process and refining it for a very long time.
Can I also just add something? This is the lawyer in me speaking. When you go through the recruitment process, I'm going to put this in two buckets. One, as a potential recruitee, corporations are very, very reluctant to get into discussions about different types of classifications of people, because there's some legal risks that come with it. Mm-hmm. That doesn't stop you from asking.
Right.
They will answer your question about it, even if they themselves may not feel comfortable about raising it themselves. Mm. So I want you to make sure that you're asking the question, because they should be able to answer the question about percentages of women, minorities, et cetera. Those questions you can ask, and they should be able to answer them. On the flip side, if you work for an organization, can we ask the question, can we ask you to self-identify? Yes, we can ask you to self-identify if you're comfortable. But if you're not, then that's fine too. But the way I tend to go about it is I want to give scenarios in terms of dealing with an international corporation, dealing with people all around the world, and who have different cultural backgrounds, who have different educational backgrounds, et cetera. And that's sort of the way I sort of come at the question about differences. And hopefully that also then gives an aperture to talk about diversity and equity, and what the company is doing, and perhaps where you might fit into that picture. So, from a corporate standpoint, that's the guidance I would give to those of us who are trying to further DEI within the corporation, but who may have some qualms about how to do it legally.
It sounds like really it's a two-way street of responsibility of the recruiter, in this case, hiring. Recruiter manages the hiring manager, and then the interviewee as well. I suppose it'd be the same as well as Claudia mentioned for working with clients, and also even supply chain or suppliers coming in. There's got to be some way to have this discussion and show that we're having that we're really favorable to this, any company in that sense. Claudia, do you mind speaking a bit about the customers? And that I'm fascinated by that. It's when you share private information between two professionals at two different companies, it does tend to create more of a stickiness of the two people working together. The old adage is people buy from people, right? And or people work with people, or people return to work with people. So I'm curious if you have any stories or comments about or any insight into working with customers and how you might broach that subject, again, to have a safe conversation, a breakthrough conversation perhaps with the customer.
Well, I think there are a couple of things. First of all, I believe we move at the speed of trust. So back to sort of the people buy from people. And if we're willing to be authentic, our customers will trust us, our clients will trust us, our employees will trust us. But if we assume our clients are all straight, we're going to be wrong 5 to 10% of the time, right? Oh, one of my favorite stories was an IBMer finally working up the courage to come out to his client. And the guy said, really? Me too. Can we quit going to football games and go to the theater instead for entertainment? I mean, it's a laughable, teachable moment. And our clients are as diverse as we are, right? And part of the corporate courage, and one of the things I'm very proud about IBM, is that we've had the courage to fire clients in the past. I remember in Atlanta when we had a client call and say, I don't want a Black sales rep.
Oh.
And the guy said, I'll get back to you. And we called them back and said, you're not going to have a Black sales rep because you're not going to have a sales rep. We do not want you as a client.
Great answer.
And that kind of corporate courage enhances the psychological safety, because then people see that they are really backed up by their corporate values. The corporations are living their values. And so those are really, really important things when you think about clients. First of all, they're like us. They have that same kind of diversity. And when we bond with them over whatever, we're going to do business quicker, easier, because there is a sense of trust.
Yeah. Mark, you want to add to that?
Yeah, I guess the only thing I would add to that is from a company standpoint is to be able to tout those types of stories. Whether it's in some type of communication from the CEO or corporate communications, what have you. You don't have to name the customer, of course. Have to embarrass them, but to tell your employees that this is what happened and this is how we reacted buys a tremendous amount of credibility with your employees that this company that I decided to come and work for is doing the right thing. And it empowers me to do the right thing too. It also tells managers about how the CEO wants them to act in similar types of situations. So I would just say find opportunities if you're on the corporate side to make sure that you tout that kind of behavior, because you'll mention that in the recruitment process. This is who we are and this is who you're signing up for. And if you're on board, we want you to be on board.
Yeah, agreed. Let me change gears a bit. We're at halfway through our time. We need to leave a little time for a Q&A at the end, but this has been a great conversation. To change gears a little bit, we talked as well during our prep meeting. We've had some discussions about even microaggression. We've talked about this a little bit. And sometimes I've had people ask, and Catherine and I, we've talked about this, what do I do if someone else says or does something that might be inappropriate or makes someone uncomfortable? Speaking about things that are short of an ethics violation, but sometimes people are not clear even when a joke or phrase might warrant that kind of reporting or that kind of almost, again, a breakthrough conversation. If you have comfortable with this person, say, just, that's not okay and I'm not feeling okay about what you said. Hopefully that would have a good response from the other professional. Mark, do you want to go first? What are there kind of, their go-to phrases you could have for this kind of thing to have that emergency breakthrough conversation in a sense?
Yeah, so this is one of those situations where, again, my lawyer hat on for for a minute, is that you definitely want to talk to your manager and probably talk with HR as well, so that it gets documented first of all. And then if you're comfortable, after speaking with your manager and speaking with HR, to go and talk to that employee directly because you feel like you have that level of a relationship, great. If you don't feel that comfortable about it, then HR needs to have that conversation with the employee. But the real import to me is making sure that you have hopefully the empowerment to speak up at all. Again, this comes back to a cultural thing at a company. Not just a legal one, which I'm hoping is driving the culture in this, at least in this one regard, that, we want to do the right thing because we legally need to do the right thing. But I hope they want to do the right thing because that's the culture of the company in the first place. and says, first of all, we're not hiring those kinds of people who would make those kinds of comments. But if somebody does make that kind of comment, one, hopefully it was perhaps not intended the way it came across, and maybe you have that conversation. Or if it was intended to be hurtful, then that's a different escalation of the situation. Sometimes we all say something dumb and like, oh, I'm really sorry I said that. But sometimes every once in a blue moon you do get somebody who makes an intentional comment, and once a company becomes aware of the statement, it has to do something. Otherwise, it runs the risk of having a hostile workplace environment tag put on it legally, which is not a good place for an organization to be in. The EEOC might get involved or what have you, and so they're going to want to document it. They're going to want to document what conversations were had and what actions they took. So, to me, again, just to recap, make sure you say something, especially to your manager and to HR, but also make sure that you are working in a place where hopefully that culture is imbued throughout the rest of the corporation.
Yeah, Claudia.
Yeah, so Mark, I appreciate your legal lens because it's very, very important. What I would add here, though, is we can't miss these opportunities as an ally, as a teaching moment. So we have to be allies for everyone. So whether the comments about a person with disability and you don't have a disability, or a woman and you're a guy, or LGBT or a person of color, whatever, we have to be allies and be willing to think about it as a teachable moment, right? So that if we speak up, and we really must as allies, we have to speak up, we have to stand up, right? Because if we don't do that, we're never going to lift up other people in the corporation. So using this as a teachable moment too, and thinking about it in that way, we can actually have some breakthrough conversations, right? It can really open dialogue in a very different way, depending on how we approach it. And again, if we feel safe enough to be an ally, right, for ourselves and for others, right? Even an ally within the acronym, right? If I'm an L, if I'm a lesbian, I have to also be an ally for the gay and the bi and the trans and the plus, right? All of that. So I also look at these things as maybe having a silver lining if we can turn them into teachable moments.
Yeah, and I like that idea of teachable moments because corporate courage really comes from personal courage of people within the company, and if you're not talking about in a good way, in a positive way, maybe a negative incident that occurred, but you turn it into a positive training moment. If you're failing to do that, you're failing to increase your corporate courage, and that let's turn that into positive. When you do speak about those things, and you do therefore increase your corporate courage, that does have a big impact, and it does enable more people, and it begins to become a self-fulfilling prophecy almost. The more you talk about something positive that could have been a negative, or something turned into a positive, that corporate culture grows, and that courage grows. And to your point, Claudia, for every person of every type of how the orientation or color or even where they might live and the things that might be facing outside of work. I'm trying to segue into the next question, which I think I'm done. I'll make this hopefully clear. We talk about this as well. It's one of my, I think, the most compelling thing to me. The three of us work in very large global companies. And how do we use that corporate courage that corporations use to make commitments to equality in the international environment? And this especially in places in regions and economies where LGBTQ rights are not established or not legally protected or even persecuted to a degree. And how do we ensure employee safety in all those circumstances? I'm personally, for some reason, I really feel strongly about this. We can use our brands and our companies to move into regions where the equality is just not there and help to increase that. Either one of you like to go first? Mark, you want to comment about that maybe first? We'll come to Claudia then.
Sure. I'd say this is probably one of the toughest questions to deal with. You know, if you are a publicly traded corporation, um, or or perhaps even if not, but definitely if you're a publicly traded corporation, the CEO's job is to return value to the shareholder. You return value to the shareholder by increasing revenue. And so therefore you've got to get customers, and you've got to get customers every year, because the numbers need to go up. And so sometimes that means that you are dealing with customers in countries that are nowhere near where we would be or we would like them to be. And Saab is not immune from that. I'm sure IBM is not immune from that. Other corporations. On the other hand, we tout in our code of conduct and in all our materials about how diverse and open and how safe we want our employees to be, while at the same time, on the other hand, we're dealing with some unsavory aspects of how to drum up business. And so there's a clash there. And I think we have to recognize that clash, because I think that clash is always going to be present. But hopefully, when I sit down and I have conversations with senior executives, what I try to do is, they're going to make a decision about what business to pursue. My job is to remind them about what our ethical and cultural responsibilities are to our employees, and what that message about the business we're pursuing also says about who we are. And for them to have the courage, to say, what, maybe we didn't meet our revenue targets, but we came pretty darn close. And here's why we didn't, is because we refused to go into this deal in this country or with this customer who didn't respect our values. And to us, that's more important, frankly, than pursuing that business. That is not a conversation that you're always going to win. But it comes back to the question that we started with at the beginning, is what type of organization do you want to be working for? And what types of, perhaps leeway you might give that organization. I think that's an individual choice, but the conversation needs to be centered around, are we doing what we said we would be doing, ethically, culturally, and our code of conduct about how we were going to conduct? And does it ring hollow, all the things you've told me about how you value me as an employee, when you're trying to deal with an organization where I can't even be sent into that country or that organization, and it's my job? Oh no, we'll send somebody else who. Oh, so it's not really a question about your values in the broader sense, towards me. It's about which one of us you can send in, so that you can still win the business. And sometimes that reminder goes a very long way, at the executive level, about whether we're going to pursue a potential business opportunity. And I feel like it's my job to make sure that gets represented.
Great. And Claudia mentioned, if you want to expand on that or go another example, but I love that story of just ceasing to do business with somebody who didn't want a particular person or type of person. Very brave of IBM, and I also have to believe it comes from, again, that personal courage, which bubbles up and grows the corporate courage. Want to add to that?
I would like to at least frame it. There have been sort of three buckets of how a corporation could go about countries that are difficult. One is called the when in Rome kind of bucket, where you just do what the local law, local culture is. The second is the embassy sort of bucket, the notion of, within the walls of IBM, you are safe, even if you're not safe within this country. And the culture is the IBM culture and the IBM values within the walls of IBM, whether it's men and women working together in the Middle East, where that's not culturally acceptable outside the walls of IBM for, men and women to work together. Those types of things are really important, but even more important is the advocate model, where even in countries that are hard, we believe the power of our brand and the power of our business, particularly in cooperation with other like-minded businesses, we have enough economic power to advocate for changes in how people are treated, because we find it to be a human rights issue.
Yes.
Right. And that, you know, bringing the power, the economic power of not building a manufacturing plant in that country and or not doing something in that particular country, and working with other corporations who are like-minded with their values, can really put pressure on, you know, governments and laws to protect human rights of various people. So, you know, we at IBM at minimum have the embassy model, and when we're our best selves, we're advocates, right? In corporations, we very seldom, I don't know that we're doing win in Rome anymore ever,
Yeah.
you know, anywhere, but we're at least at that embassy level, and would encourage everybody to do that. It's a recruiting advantage, right? When people, bright, talented people, can feel like they can be authentic within the walls of IBM, even if they can't feel safe outside the walls of the corporation, they, you know, they will gravitate to us, they will be retained by us, and they'll be promoted by us because they'll do their best work.
Yeah, and I agree with both of you. That's the one thing for me, you know, imagine leveraging our collective or even individual brands and companies to go in and, let's say you have two candidates and they're equal on paper, and yet one identifies as LGBTQ. I'd hire that person in a country to give them that safe harbor, that embassy at a minimum, and hopefully they can then take the next step with the company and really begin to grow and become a leader for equality rights in that particular country. And to me, that's exciting, and I think that's something that I know you all were doing here as well. So,
and also I'll just say, making sure that if we decide not to do it, they know exactly why.
Right. Yes.
It was an opportunity that was all within your control, and you lost it, and here's the reason why.
Yeah, absolutely right. I think it's fair because there are people who may be listening to that conversation, or the next leaders coming up, let's say in that company, who can then make that change and say, well, we lost that X amount of years ago. Let's change that because it's the right thing to do, but it also grows business. And those are two things that go very well, very much hand in hand. So,
or hopefully that they're losing more than one opportunity,
right?
And collectively it starts saying, you know what, we've lost these 5 deals, what we could have won,
yeah,
because of this issue.
Yeah,
that will definitely have an impact.
Yes, yeah. Catherine, you're on mute. Welcome back. There you go.
Thank you so much. I am breaking in only because we've got about 15 minutes left in our session, and there are so many great questions that I think it'd be great to weave in some of those questions into this conversation, because I think you've really tapped into all of your comments, tapped into something that's top of mind for a lot of our attendees. And I will say up front that I am not going to be able to get to all the questions, and I'm going to try to merge a couple questions. And if I don't get to yours, I'm very sorry. I'm trying to do it in the order that I've seen them across the 2 platforms. But hopefully, I mean, find me afterwards, and I'll just make sure that I connect with the team and get answers or feedback to some of the questions. So one of the first questions came in or early on when you're talking about self-identification and that bravery that it takes to self-identify. I'm going to try to kind of weave in 2 questions I saw in a couple of threads I see throughout. How do people really decide if they're willing to self-identify in different workplaces? And this goes to real safety versus perceived safety. And so there was a question from someone about even with in an organization that has an LGBTQ plus ERG, it might not feel safe for people of identities like transgender identities or non-binary identities. So can you talk about like what are those earmarks, maybe those cultural earmarks that you think you'd guide people to, or what advice you'd give them? And specifically, this person asks, what are the benefits and risks associated with self-identification?
So let me start with the last question, some of the benefits and risks. one of my HR professionals said to me, Claudia, nobody's ever come and said, hire me because I'm just like everyone else. So our differences can be our competitive advantages, right? They can be part of the skills and experiences and the identities that we bring to the table that enrich and help companies innovate, right? Because there's plenty of research that innovation comes from not only having diversity, but including it, valuing it, right? And listening to it. So there's benefit to the company of you owning up your diversity. And oh, by the way, there's a benefit to you for differentiating yourself. But a lot of companies like IBM can cross-reference self-ID'd people with things like top talent lists that managers have created. And so enable the LGBT top talent to get mentoring or some leadership training, or make sure that we've got them on slates for candidates and openings. So there are lots of upside, being able to also show your leadership skills as you lead a BRG or ERG, as you step into roles where you're going beyond your day job, right? So there are really opportunities to distinguish yourself if you've got the courage to be authentic.
So Mark, I value your perspective on this, that self-identification, benefit, risk conversation, and the culture question that I think is at the heart of that question and a lot of other questions that folks are asking.
Well, just because I know that we have a lot of questions, I'll make this short. Let me answer, because I think Claudia did a beautiful job answering that question. How do you know whether you can self-identify and what's the indicia that you should be looking for? I would say that's an individual question. Unfortunately, neither Claudia or I are in your situation to kind of tell you what sort of strands you should be looking for. Let me give you some ideas, however. If your company has ERGs, particularly an LGBTQ plus ERG, that's probably a decent sign. If there are executives who are LGBT, not only were they brought into the company or were they promoted, that kind of gives you some idea in terms of whether you can grow professionally there. Are they recruiting LGBT employees in particular at fairs like Out and Equal, and trying to increase diversity in their talent pool? Those are all sort of indicia of maybe this place might be safe for me to self-identify, and it's not going to cost me my career. In fact, it may be a plus for my career, because I know when I sit around trying to figure out who I'm going to promote, if all things being equal, I'm trying to make sure that my team and my leadership team expresses that diversity as well. And I can't do that if I don't know.
Great. Thank you. Chris, anything you want to add before
No,
we ask
thank you.
Great. So there's a number of other questions just about hiring managers. So the one question that came in early is, what kind of programming or training do you find most effective for hiring managers in order to have those breakthrough conversations? And someone else asked, any ideas you'd share for companies to do more to attract talented LGBTQ plus potential employees? I think those are nice sort of bookend questions.
Yeah, I think what Claudia mentioned about going end to end, looking at your entire recruiting process, and making sure that it's the concepts of hiring for equality, for diversity are every step of the way. As we all know, sometimes in the middle of the day, you have to conduct an interview and you may have your mind focused elsewhere. And even a small comment at the top of an interview box, say, make sure you hit these things and talk about these things with the company, the benefits, that could be helpful for a manager.
Oh, I'm talking to myself. Anything that you'd like to add, Mark or Claudia?
Not for me. In an effort to try and get to as many questions as we can, I think Chris's answer sounded good to me.
The only other comment I would make is ally training helps everybody. So it helps hiring managers, it helps managers, it helps employees. So learning to be an ally of groups that are different from you, and what that means about how you talk about things, how you create a sense of safety. That kind of training helps everybody.
Yeah.
Great. There's a specific question about an industry, but I don't think that this is necessarily kind of specific to this industry, real estate. That's sort of the resistant to diversity, and companies may face implicit bias. How do you start? How do you overcome that kind of entrenched culture at the local office level?
Well, I think you have to figure out what are your baby steps. What do you think the organization might be willing to sign up to? Maybe they might be willing to do the corporate equality index just to kind of get a feel for where they are, because nobody likes to feel like they're generally, most people don't like to feel like they're not being diverse and inclusive, especially if you're a company and you're trying to recruit the best talent. That usually is not an indication that you're competitive for everybody, including the top talent. So try to figure out what are the baby steps that your organization might be willing to do. Are they willing to have an LGBT employee resource group? Are they willing to do various surveys or what have you? I think you have to start small, but come back with like a longer term plan, for over 2-3 years, and say, okay, well, this is, I know it's going to be really difficult here, but 3 years from now, if I'm going to be here, I would sort of like to see us at this point. And what are the steps do I need to get there? Who do I need to talk to that might be allies within the company? Because I almost assure you that there will be allies. It's not like everybody. Who are the pressure points within the organization? Maybe you have to start with HR. Maybe you start with somebody who has the ear of the executive vice president or the CEO or what have you, and say, you know what, I don't feel like I really am comfortable and welcomed here as much as I need to. And if that statement doesn't shake somebody, well, then go start your own business.
And I agree with you, Mark, because first of all, I would say to each of us individually, we have to be very good at what we do. And if we're very good at what we do, we will have options, right? So go start your own company, go to another company that values who you are. But as part of your own personal courage, you've got to ask for what you want, right? And in doing that, we have to do our homework to say, here's a company very much like ours who does this, right? And so here's a roadmap. Let me help, right? But we, as members, we are the corporation, by the way, have to have the courage to say, you say these things are our values, but we're not living them. Here's what living them looks like, if from my perspective, or what it's not looking like from my perspective. So I would suggest that we have to take ownership of the places where we work.
Yeah. It goes back to that personal courage becoming your corporate courage.
Yeah.
Exactly. So I think we've got time for at least one more question. And I'll focus on one that really touches on the international conversation you started. And I think I, for one, had not heard the model that you shared, Claudia, the when in Rome versus embassy versus advocacy model. Love it. It's so clear. And so there's a question about if there's data to show a company to explain those embassy versus advocacy model and figure out which one is best for them. Anything that you think you could point people to?
Not off the top of my head. However, part of it is understanding their own view, right, of the world. And so at least the embassy model, you've got to start there where it's safe for everyone within the walls of your corporation, right? And the advocacy one goes to your own corporation's courage, whether you have to join with other people or you're willing, like IBM was in the 60s, to say to the states of North Carolina and Kentucky, we're not going to build manufacturing plants here until blacks and whites don't have separate toilets and drinking fountains, right? And so the laws of North Carolina and Kentucky both changed because of the corporate courage, because of the advocacy model, right? And so we did that on our own. But in some places where it's harder, maybe it's having the corporations that you guys can all network with here in Out Equal and other places to get your corporate dialogue together to say, it's really hard in Poland right now. What can we do in Poland together, right? That's really important.
Yeah.
Look at what your competitors are doing. That to me is usually a really good starter conversation with senior executives. So if your competitors are answering the CEI and they have a higher score, if your company is in Poland, but they are doing something different than what other Polish companies do in terms of leading on diversity and inclusion, that's another good indication. Look at what types of surveys best of, whether it's, the best place for women or the best place for African Americans or what have you. The accumulation of all of that tells a story, especially vis-a-vis your competitors, because your argument is going to be, we are losing out on incredibly talented people, or we have a high turnover rate. And here's the reason potentially why. And I think if you have that conversation within your company, unless they're tone deaf, nobody likes to think that we're losing out on top talented people because top talented people don't want to come to work for us. So, I think those are some of the things that I would suggest that people take a look at.
Great.
Awesome. So Chris, I'm going to turn it over back to you to kind of close us out. Like I said, we don't have time for all these great questions, but I'm seeing everybody react to each other. And so there's a lot of cross learning going on actually in the chats. So
Yeah.
Chris, anything you'd like to say in
I just
closing?
want to thank Mark and Claudia. It's very late where Claudia is. So Claudia, thank you again. Mark, it's even later than Chicago where you are. It's by an hour, but thank you as well. And I think this has been a wonderful time together. And I've learned a number of things. I'm going to go back with Catherine and have discussions about how we can employ some of the things we've learned today. So thank you for your time, both of you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. It's an honor to be here.
Thank you. I feel the
Thank
same.
you all very much. Good night, everybody.
Okay.
And we'll see you bright and early tomorrow morning.
Thank you.